One night in 1860, Age's roving sight was riveted on a marvelous scene in the tiny village of Khorramshahr, Persia, present day Iran. The night was dark. In a lonely, desolate area outside of town, a child of 7 was lying on the floor of the Tower of Silence, a dead body tied to his feet. Gasping at this bizarre scene, Age pondered, if a vulture swoops to devour the corpse, what will happen to the child? He too will perish. How brave this little boy is! Even several adults huddled together would not dare to stay in such a place. Age's eyes remained glued to the child, and when dawn arrived, the child was still safe. Age was then convinced that God was watching over this boy and his future was assured. Who was this child? He was the same one who was to become a dervish, of whom the divine voice had spoken. O Age, the world is eager to hear his story. In Persia during the 19th century, the plight of the Zoroastrians was terrible. The atmosphere of the holy land of the Magi had changed drastically since the prophet Zoroaster had sanctified Persia 7,000 years before. The followers of Zoroaster were considered kafirs, unbelievers, by the Muslims and were systematically mistreated and oppressed. The star of Islam was held high, and those who did not embrace the Mohammedan religion were mercilessly persecuted. The lives of the Zoroastrians were in constant danger, and no one was their protector except for Ahurmazd, their god. The lives of all Zoroastrians were in constant peril in Persia. Over the centuries, the majority of Zoroastrians had converted to Islam, and most of those who refused had fled to India. Those who did not migrate from Persia had to bow before the Muslims and their laws and tolerate their cruelty and harassments. No one was to blame for this situation. The wheel of time spins circumstances according to divine law. From the humanistic point of view, such a condition could well be viewed as unnatural. Man persecuting man in the name of religion. But without God's will, nothing happens. The spread of Islam and the Muslims' outrages openly perpetrated against the Zoroastrian community in Persia in the 1800s brought about this natural state of unnaturalness. In those days, torture and kidnapping of Zoroastrian children was not infrequent. It is said that Muslims would trick a Zoroastrian boy to enter their house. Behind locked doors and shaded windows, they would force the boy to stand within a circle. Every Muslim present had a needle concealed behind his back, and one by one they would stick the needle into him. The boy would eventually collapse and die. The body would then be flung into the streets of the Zoroastrian community. Zoroastrian women also faced every type of assault and humiliation, and their lives especially were in constant peril. However much abused or vilified, they had to bear it or face certain death. The Muslims violently restrained the Zoroastrian from practicing their religion. The worship of fire, symbolic of the universal struggle between the forces of light and of darkness. They fanatically believed that it was their duty in Islam to curtail the spread of this blasphemous faith. However insulted or abused they were, the Zoroastrian did not dare utter a word in retort to the Muslims. They could not defend or justify themselves before their persecutors. Although they would often become angry, they would not express it to the Muslims. To vent their anger, they resorted to a clever outlet. Opposite their houses, all Zoroastrian had a pillar sunk in the ground, and kicking or hitting it and spitting on it, they would pretend that the post was their enemy. This daily outburst would relieve their frustration, and they were then better able to tolerate the persecution they constantly faced. But at times, even the Zoroastrian resorted to acts of barbarity. For example, This incident is said to have occurred in the town of Khorramshahr, the place of Sheriar's birth, just outside of Yazd. One day, a Zoroastrian was riding his horse through the town. As a sign of respect, Zoroastrians were required to dismount on passing a Muslim, even a Muslim child. On the way, the rider saw a Muslim child, but he did not get off his horse and the child cursed him loudly. The Zoroastrian had tolerated enough. He looked about and not seeing anyone got down and caught the child. He covered the child's mouth and threw him in a nearby well. Then the man immediately left town and boarded a ship bound for India. The fate of the child is not known. In such troubled times, Sheriar Irani was born on 21 March 1853. Sheriar's father, Mundegar, like most Zoroastrians, was a poor man. How could the Zoroastrians, who were considered infidels, prosper in this land of religious strife? Besides farming and gardening, in which all participated, Mundegar's job was that of the caretaker of the local Tower of Silence, the place where the Zoroastrians brought their dead to be devoured by vultures. It was not a well-paying vocation, but Mundegar managed to support his family of two sons and one daughter. Sheriar's mother died when he was only 5 years old, and Mundegar, of course, was profoundly grieved by her passing. Mundegar was not an Orthodox Zoroastrian, though he practiced the tenets of his faith, nor was he a zealot. He had his own religious feelings and would participate in both Mohammedan and Zoroastrian festivals because he recognized divinity in everyone. He had a gregarious nature and was able to mingle freely with both communities. But he was somewhat of an enigma to his Muslim neighbors because he was a devout follower of Mohammedan saint, a Wali Allah, in Khorramshahr and was often seen going to the saint. But because of his devotion to this Mohammedan saint, Mundegar and his children were spared the more cruel blows of persecution that faced most of the Zoroastrian community. Mundegar was an exceptionally good man who never neglected his paternal duty towards his children. He considered the persecution at the hands of the Muslims as a means of spiritual self-effacement. Although poor, he remembered God constantly, and because of this, he thought himself more fortunate than many wealthy persons. After Sheriar's mother's death, Sheriar was well cared for by his elder brother and sister, Khodadad and Piroza. Sheriar did not go to school but would accompany his father to the Tower of Silence each day, where he would play alone. The young boy had a contemplative nature, and this was where he would pray and meditate. In Persia at that time, only the children of the rich could obtain a formal education. There was no chance of admission to school for a poor Zoroastrian. Often at night during his lonely vigils over the dead, Mundegar would grieve for his departed wife, but his little son's companionship would comfort him. Sheriar's innocent prattle would amuse his bereaved father, and often Mundegar would be awestruck by how innately wise his son was and by the thoughtfulness of his conversation. During the years at the Tower of Silence, an intense interest in the things of spiritual was awakened in Sheriar, and he thought deeply about finding God. He was an intelligent, adventurous boy and was not afraid of anything, a characteristic which remained with him throughout his life. One day, when Sheriar was 7 years old, his father went to do some work in the town and left him alone at the Tower of Silence. Mundegar was delayed in returning, and during the evening, the corpse of a child was brought. Since it was after sunset, the last rites could not be performed until daylight. Thus, the funeral party left the corpse outside the wall of the tower. In that lonely, desolate area, vultures hovered over the corpse, but little Sheriar threw rocks to keep them away. Sheriar determined to protect the child's body until the final rites could be performed. He tied the legs of the child to his own feet and lay down next to the corpse. The vultures screeched furiously, but not one swept down upon the boy. When Mundegar returned, he found Sheriar sleeping next to the corpse of the child, with their legs tied together. He was amazed at the bravery of his small son. Every day, in peaceful contemplation, Sheriar would sit alone in the compound of the funeral grounds, immersed in the remembrance of God. The boy's heart had awakened and he began to long for the sight of God. One day, when he was absorbed in concentration, all of a sudden he was startled to see a young woman running toward him. When the woman, a Zoroastrian, reached him, he saw that she was perspiring, out of breath, and exhausted. Tearfully, she told Sheriar that Muslims were chasing her and begged him to help save her from capture. Nearby was a small bakery where naan, unleavened bread, was prepared and, in memory of the deceased, distributed to the poor by their relatives. That day no one had died, and so the large oven was not lit. Sheriar guided the girl to it, helped her climb inside, and then returned to his place of meditation. Shortly thereafter, several Muslim horsemen came galloping up to the tower and demanded, "Boy, did you see a girl run past this way a few minutes ago?" Sheriar replied, "I have been here for almost an hour, but I haven't seen a dog pass by. No girl has run from here." Believing him, the Muslims rode off, and Sheriar was happy he had not lied. It was a fact that no dog had wandered past that day, and the girl had not run from there. Sheriar went to the bakery and safely escorted the young woman to her home, where he was received with deep gratitude by her family. Sheriar's spiritual inclination flourished early, and he must have met the Mohammedan Wali with his father. From childhood, he had a detached outlook on life and was devoid of any material ambition. He did not think of himself as prospering in this world. When a human corpse would arrive at the Tower of Silence, he would think, "Death is inevitable. The happy as well as the miserable die. What is the meaning of life? What is its goal? Everyone departs from this world leaving his or her joys and sorrows behind. So why not give them up while alive?" But how? Sheriar's heart was restless to find answers that would satisfy him. One day in 1865, Sheriar told his father of his longing, bid farewell to his family, and left home. He was only 12 years old. The boy had never once stepped out of his hometown of Khorramshahr and did not know where to go when he began wandering throughout what is now Iran. He carried just a few items of clothing, rested anywhere at night, and sustained himself on begged food. This young dervish had firm and total reliance on God. He relied solely on his help. What other help did he need? He had dedicated himself to finding God, and with the repetition of his name, Yazdan, Yazdan, Yazdan. At every step, he searched for him. Sheriar was destined to undergo severe hardships during his wanderings, but he did not lose courage. On the contrary, he gained inner strength through his suffering since he was coming nearer to God. Dervishes were not always well received in Persia. At times, the boy received insults instead of food, and at times, he was beaten instead of given shelter. But he who discards the world becomes God's, and this was Sheriar's destiny. One day, the boy's roaming brought him to the town of Bafte Badnian. Exhausted and hungry, Sheriar approached a bakery, begging a loaf of bread for his evening meal. The baker was about to give him the bread when an old Muslim ascetic who daily received a loaf from the shop arrived. The baker looked at the emaciated child with pity and then told the Muslim ascetic, "Today you will not get bread because I am giving your portion to your little brother." The old ascetic became incensed at being denied his alms and began quarreling with the shopkeeper. "I am a true fakir," he shouted. "This boy is false. Are you really going to feed this rascal instead of me? You get bread every day." The baker reasoned. "Why are you grumbling if I give it once to a chance wanderer, especially one so young?" The fakir gave Sheriar a contemptuous glance and then retorted, "You call this brat a dervish? You fool! I am a true fakir. This boy is nothing but a beggar." The heated quarrel went on while a crowd began to gather. At last the fakir said, "If this boy is a real dervish who loves God and is not a hypocrite, I challenge him to answer my questions." Sheriar was ashamed of the fakir's rude behavior and wanted to avoid a debate. But the shopkeeper and others in the crowd urged him to accept the challenge. So a vigorous debate about God ensued. With sharp wit and keen intelligence, the boy replied to every question the fakir could pose, and the crowd cheered him on. The fakir, who had gotten the worst of it, was thoroughly embarrassed. He retreated under a barrage of abuse from the crowd, while Sheriar was rewarded with a delicious supper. There were times when Sheriar would travel with other renunciants. Once, while walking along with three older dervishes, he took refuge with them in a dense forest. Sitting around the campfire, the three dervishes boasted of their travels, courage, and wisdom. In their eyes, their younger companion was mere initiate on the spiritual path. When their pride got the better of them, one said, "Were a tiger to appear before me, I have the strength to kill it with my bare hands." The second responded, "I could reduce the beast to ashes with my sight alone." The last bragged, "I would tame it and ride on its back and journey from place to place." Sheriar kept quiet, knowing he possessed no such powers. The next day, as they were wandering through the forest, they spotted a python, and the three, who had been boasting of their bravery the night before, ran away in fright. Sheriar found a rock and fearlessly crushed the head of the large snake. Even when the head of a snake is crushed, its body continues to coil. Likewise, when the boy approached the three men, their pride had not subdued, and they said, "Don't think we were afraid of the python. To kill it was so insignificant, we left it to you. Since you are the youngest." The boy did not rebuke them. Besides wandering through such wilderness, while searching for the truth, Sheriar visited many shrines, including the tombs of the great mystical poets Hafiz and Sadi in Shiraz, and contacted many advanced souls. He learned palmistry and astrology, which provided him with an honorable means of livelihood during the latter part of his travels. Although Sheriar had no formal education as a child, he appeared to gain knowledge of reading and writing Persian, Arabic, and Hebrew so suddenly. It was as if a veil had been torn away, revealing this past knowledge to him. Sheriar even wrote 2 books in Persian before he left his home country, but nothing further is known about them. After all sorts of penance, experiences, and suffering, Sheriar was as dissatisfied and discontented as when he had left his home. 8 years of the hardest type of austerity and the most impoverished type of existence had no fulfilled his aim to gain one ray of the sun. Frustrated and disappointed in Persia, the young man of 20, instead of despairing and abandoning his search for God, resolved to leave for India to carry on his search. In 1873 or 1874, with his elder brother, Khodadad Sheriar boarded a steamer headed for the port of Bombay. In India, Khodadad found employment in a shop and prevailed upon Sheriar to do the same. Sheriar agreed, and his brother arranged a position for him in the same shop. But in spite of accepting a job for the first time in his life, Sheriar did not change his ascetic ways. He strictly maintained his vegetarian diet as well as denying himself alcohol and tobacco. He was virtuous and endowed with a natural goodness. When not working, he spent most of his time meditating or reciting the name of God. Even while doing his job, Sheriar's inner attention was directed toward remembering God. He made no show, but he also made no secret of his devout nature. Looking every inch a typical Persian dervish, he kept his hair long and always wore a long white robe. The shopkeeper was very much the opposite, a materialist who despised Sheriar's pity and would scold him on the slightest pretext. Although Sheriar had come to India seeking light, so far he had found only darkness. When the owner finally accused him of dishonesty, Sheriar quit rather than be the target of such unjust accusation. Thus, after 5 months, he was free once again. He took his wages but kept only 2 rupees. The rest he gave away. It seems as if this employment, which had been thrust upon him, was destiny's brief respite for Sheriar, although the job had not been easy. As it turned out, Sheriar was to wander for 10 more years throughout India under circumstances much more trying than those he had already undergone in Iran. With the 2 rupees he had kept, Sheriar purchased a wooden bowl and a staff. With no further money, he decided to walk to Karachi over 1,000 miles north. He wandered through Gujarat and Kutch, passing through Surat, Vadhavan, and Mandvi. The long days of walking severely blistered his feet. Yet he did not stop. He found shelter under a tree at night and during the day continued walking, repeating Yazdan. If he happened to be given food as alms, he would eat. Otherwise, he would consider it God's wish that he fast. Sheriar's path crossed that of many sadhus, yogis, and penitent ascetics, and he took refuge at places of pilgrimage. After a rigorous journey of 4 months in a weak and emaciated condition, he reached Karachi at last. Why he had walked to that city is unknown. Perhaps he knew someone there. But after staying a month and regaining part of his strength, he resumed his journey, this time without a fixed destination. Sheriar began wandering aimlessly in the scorching Sindh desert. After a few weeks, his feet were again blistered and raw, and his tongue was swollen from thirst. Resting on the burning sands offered no relief from the blazing sun. He tried desperately to plod forward, but he was so weak each step became more and more difficult. Finally, he could not move one step further. Crying out, Yazdan, he fainted. There was neither water nor shelter in this part of the desert. Sheriar's death seemed certain. Age was worried. Is this the end of Sheriar's spiritual search? Will the ascetic die of thirst in this seemingly God-forsaken place? Has he been wandering all these years in search of God only to die in this cruel way? He could not die yet. Slowly he opened his eyes. Standing before him were two figures staring at him, an old, bearded man and a boy. Each was holding a leather bag filled with life-giving water. Sheriar struggled to his knees and stretched out his hands for water. The boy poured a little into his palms, but Sheriar's thirst was not quenched. Extending his hands towards the figures, he silently prayed for more. But no more was given. Both figures turned and walked away. Sheriar stared at them until they disappeared, and then, with all his strength, he stood up. Realizing if he stayed where he was, he would die, he took God's name and stumbled onward. But after going a short distance, he again fainted. How could he cross the desert? He had neither water nor food, and he was alone in a remote, barren region. Who would help him? Had he hallucinated sipping the water? Then, startled from unconsciousness, he saw the old man and boy again standing before him ready to help. This time they allowed Sheriar to drink fully of the cool water. His eyes conveyed his gratitude. Yet the old man sternly asked, "Why have you come here? Why do you distress the Almighty with your foolish behavior?" Sheriar could not answer. Pointing, the old man instructed, "Take this path. You will come across the hut of a hermit, and he will feed you. After you have eaten, if you walk in the opposite direction, you will find a town." Sheriar listened with head bowed. He felt revived after drinking the cool water. When he raised his head to thank the old man and boy, there was no one there. He was awestruck and humbled, and his trust in God's protection was strengthened. Full of love and gratitude, he prostrated himself on the sand and prayed with all his heart. But who were the old man and boy? Age wondered. They were divine messengers or abdals, spiritual agents of the perfect masters. Such abdals rescue endangered persons as they traverse the spiritual path. Taking the path shown through the sands, Sheriar walked to the hut where, without his asking, an old hermit offered him bread. Sheriar ate half at the hut and took the other half with him as he walked in silence toward the town. After walking several miles, Sheriar came to the banks of a broad, swift river which he could not cross since he did not know how to swim. Although he wondered if he had followed the directions properly, he was not alarmed, fully believing that God would send someone to help him across. Sheriar decided to lie down near the banks to wait. He fell asleep, but after a short nap, he was awakened by the sound of tinkling camel bells. A caravan had arrived and Sheriar asked its leader how he intended to cross the river. The man replied that the river had become shallow enough to allow the camels to cross and that the men would ride on them. When Sheriar implored the man to take him across the river, the person demanded 2 rupees. Sheriar explained that he was a renunciant and had no money, not even a paisa, a penny. But the man did not believe him and proceeded to take his caravan across the river and gradually disappeared. Although no one else arrived, Sheriar was not worried. Trusting in God, he was convinced that his mercy would find a way to get him across the river. As night fell and inner peace came over him, the moon shone brightly and Sheriar's tranquility merged with the silvery reflection in the rippling waters. Awestruck by the splendor of nature's beauty so near the desolation of the desert, Sheriar longed in his heart for the sight of God. He had been searching for so long, he wept out of longing and joy. Seated on the bank of the river, feeling hungry, he took out the remaining loaf of bread. Schools of fish swam before him, and seeing them, Sheriar broke the bread into pieces and tossed them to the fish. His appetite left him in the enjoyment of watching the fish leap out of water for the crumbs. Suddenly, he heard a harsh voice demanding, "What are you doing here?" Turning around, he faced a tall, burly man who towered over him. "I am waiting to be taken across the river," he answered. "I cannot swim." Hearing his reply, the stranger laughed and said, "How do you expect to cross it by sitting here, you fool? You don't have to swim. Come with me and I will show you a way." Sheriar followed the man to a mud embankment that stretched all the way across the river. He was perplexed to see this natural bridge, which he was certain he would have noticed earlier, and inwardly he began to praise God for his mercy. Reaching the other side, Sheriar was about to thank the mysterious guide when the man took his hand in his hand and said, "There is no need to thank me. Now hold on to my hand. I will take you to the town through a shortcut." The guide swiftly zigzagged through the darkness, talking cheerfully along the way. Sheriar felt a strange sensation as he held on listening to the man's conversation, as if the earth were slipping away beneath his feet. After a short time, the lights of a town were visible, and before he knew it, he was walking in a bustling street. The guide took him to a pan and tobacco shop and said, "Wait for me here until 11 o'clock." Then he walked away. When it was nearly midnight, there was still no sign of his unknown friend. The shopkeeper was starting to close up for the night, and Sheriar asked him, "How far is it from this town to the river?" "60 miles," replied the shopkeeper casually. Sheriar could not believe it. He had covered 60 miles in about half an hour. He then knew that God had sent an angel to help him, and his heart cried out, "Oh Yazdan, you are infinitely loving. You are infinitely merciful. But why don't you allow me to have sight of you? My life is only for you. I love you, and you alone." Intense longing for God realization overcame Sheriar. After the divine help he had experienced, his search for truth became even more intense. He resolved within himself to sacrifice his very life in pursuit of his beloved. And he vowed not to give up under any circumstance. Saved from death by God's direct intervention, Sheriar roamed once more throughout India under the ever-present clouds of austerity and deprivation. Barefoot, bearded, and in a dervish robe, he walked through streets and down lanes and alleys to contact saints and advanced souls, foregoing food or comfort to have their contact. At night, he would rest wherever he could, along a sidewalk, under a tree, or in a cave, often in dirt-filled or rock-strewn spaces. He begged for whatever food he received and, as always, accepted it as God's mercy. Convinced that God would not forget his lover, he was a true orphan of God. He walked and walked, mile after mile, year after year. His feet became raw, cut by rocks and stones and pierced by thorns. But the wounds on his feet were nothing compared to the wounds in his heart. A burning love urged him on with the name of Yazdan, 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 ever on his lips. His search continued. When Sheriar reached Gujarat, he saw a village some miles in the distance beyond a small river. In the middle of the river was an island thick with vegetation. The local people, however, were superstitious and warned him not to go there. "No one ventures across the river," they said, "because of the soft muddy bottom. The island is covered by thick brambles, and a hideous ghost lives there. Take our advice. Do not go to that island, but take the road to the town 5 miles ahead." But Sheriar replied, "I am not afraid of ghosts. If there is a ghost on the island, I shall meet him." Irrespective of their counsel, he began to wade through the shallow water. By the time he reached the island, it was dark, and instead of finding a ghost, he found himself ensnared in the overhanging vines of a dense jungle. Fumbling about and again wading across the river from what he thought was the other side of the island, he forged his way. Soon he found himself exactly where he had started. It was too late then to take the long road, so he decided to try to wade across the river once again. This time he wanted to avoid the island he entered at another point, but when he reached midstream, he stepped into quicksand. His staff sank in the soft mud, and the more he struggled to get out, the more he sank. While sinking in the mud, he prayed, "O God, if it is your divine will that I should die in this way, I am ready. But before I die, allow me to have one glimpse of your effulgence. For years I have thirsted for your sight. I have not cared about my life. Give me a glimpse of your beauty before I die." Concentrating on repeating God's name, Sheriar struggled, pulling himself out of the quagmire. When he reached the other side, he collapsed and thanked God for rescuing him. After a while, hearing some villagers, Sheriar held them. Show me the way to the town, he requested. Seeing this strange, ominous, mud covered figure rising out of the shadows, the men ran away shouting, "The ghost! The ghost of the island is after us!" A few of the men cautiously approached him, holding lanterns and clubs in their hands, and when they were reassured that he was indeed only a stranger in need of guidance, they brought him to their village, gave him buttermilk, and attended to his needs. During his 10 years of wandering in India, God saved Sheriar's life one other time. He tried to cross a river, but the current was so swift that it nearly swept him off his feet. Had he fallen, he would surely have drowned. But by God's grace, Sheriar managed to forge across. In the course of his travels, Sheriar came across different types of yogis, ascetics, and penitents. Once he encountered a man in Ratlam who had been sitting for years in one position, supported only by his thumbs. But this form of asceticism was not for Sheriar. His suffering was a thirst for the wine of love. Shortly thereafter, in the same district of Ratlam, he encountered an old woman seated near a lake on the outskirts of the town. The woman made signs for him to go into the village, which he did. Everything there was spotlessly clean, but not a single living person was seen. Amazed, Sheriar instantly realized that the village was an apparition, an illusion to be taken as a metaphor. Though the house of the heart be pure, it takes ages for God to enter. He understood what he had seen and returned to the old woman, who silently gave him a loaf of bread as prasad. After eating, he left without having exchanged a word with her. While journeying through the hills near Jaora, Sheriar encountered an elderly man deeply immersed in meditation. After some time, the man opened his eyes and asked, "What do you want, my son?" Sheriar replied, "I do not want anything. I am a seeker of beloved God." Hearing this, the old man was deeply pleased and said, "You are blessed." In the midst of his travels, although Sheriar encountered many sadhus and saints, he found that none of them could satisfy his inner quest nor quiet his restlessness. He was destined to find peace in a different way. As the years passed, Sheriar became increasingly despondent. He began to doubt if his aim would ever be achieved. He felt hopeless as never before. He knew that with his formidable determination, he could venture anywhere, yet he could not accomplish what he wanted, to realize God. His perseverance was turning into bitter frustration. As a last resort, Sheriar wandered to an isolated forest in Gujarat where he decided to perform what is known as Chilla Nashini, a severe spiritual penance. A circle is drawn on the ground by the penitent's own hand. For 40 days and nights, he must not step out of the circle, foregoing food and sleep. He must face whatever comes. Those who try it but do not succeed usually die or go mad. There appeared to be no other solution or choice in Sheriar's mind. He was 30 years old. It had been 18 years since he had left his hometown of Khorramshahr as a boy. He had always been chaste. He had lived on alms. He had been honest and brave. But everything he had done seemed in vain, for he had not achieved union with God. To return to the world and live in conformity with society was abhorrent to him. Sheriar had reached the point where it had to be either realization of God or death. Sure of his decision, he drew the circle around him on the ground, his heart imploring God to come and meet him. Slowly, time passed. After some days, he heard horrible screams, then terrible noises. Suddenly, a roaring lion appeared in front of him, ready to pounce and devour him. Sheriar did not move. The lion disappeared. Some time later, a ferocious tiger appeared and stalked around the circle for hours. Again, Sheriar did not move, and the tiger disappeared. Once flames rose out of the ground on all sides of the circle. The flames moved closer to him, and he was convinced he would be burned alive. Still, he did not move, and the flames died. Wild shouting giants appeared with spears held menacingly. They had painted faces like masks of death with blood in their eyes. Sheriar still did not move, and they too eventually disappeared. Many other dreadful apparitions came and vanished. The torturous visions became continual. His mind suffered greatly. Courageously, Sheriar held on and did not move from inside the circle for 30 days. Only 10 more days were left for the completion of the Chilla, but it became too difficult for him to continue. A moment longer in the circle was more than he could endure. It was not possible for him to continue. He stepped out. All his years of penance and austerity had resulted in apparent defeat. Disheartened and half dead, Sheriar dragged himself near a river and collapsed weeping. He fell unconscious into a deep slumber. Age too was weeping. How pitiful! 18 years of unimaginable asceticism had ended in bitter disappointment. Could God not have mercy on this sincere pilgrim? Is this man to meet with such disappointment the rest of his life? What is to become of him? He wanted to die, but God denied him even this. Is there anything in his destiny besides his unfulfilled ideals? Yes, assuredly there is. A divine voice spoke, stirring Sheriar from sleep. O Sheriar, he whom you seek, he whom you wish to see, his attainment is not your destiny. It is your son who will attain it. And through your son, you. Sheriar looked around, but no one was there. Dazed, he heard the echo fading. Your son, through your son. He was puzzled and questioned. Is this the voice of God? Is God commanding me? I have no son, no wife. After a while he thought, but what is wrong in living a family life if it is God's command? His wish means everything, so there is no question of right or wrong. With these thoughts, Sheriar again fell asleep and slept soundly for 3 days. When he awakened, he remembered the words he had heard and not knowing how to fulfill the divine injunction, began walking southward toward Pune. Some power was guiding him to follow its course, but he did so indifferently. Day after day, he trudged on with a feeling of abject resignation and journeyed more than 400 miles. Led safely to the city of Pune, he found the house of his sister, Firoza, who had immigrated from Iran. As he crossed the threshold of her home, he was so emaciated and worn out that he sought only to erase the exhaustion of the many years of wandering. Tears of joy welled in Firoza's eyes as she opened the door and saw her brother. Both fell into each other's embrace, and with deep love and affection, she welcomed him into her home where he stayed for some time. Sheriar's heart, however, was still crying out for something else. Austerity had not fulfilled his longing, yet he did not wish to give up the life of a dervish. How could he reveal this inner spiritual anguish to his kindly sister?